every weekday live on First Post. Hello and welcome to First Post Africa, where we get you the top stories from the continent and from across the world. I'm Alyson at Grange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa. First, let's take a look at the headlines. Now, Russian forces hold military drills near Ukraine's border, simulating the use of tactical nuclear weapons in response to what Moscow says are threats from the West's involvement in the conflict. Norway, Ireland and Spain to recognize Palestine as a state from the 28th of May. Palestinian leaders hail the move as historic. Israeli Prime Minister calls it a prize to murderers. China imposes sanctions on a number of U.S. defense firms over what it calls Washington's economic coercion against Chinese companies and its sales of arms to Taiwan. French President Emmanuel Macron flies to France's Pacific territory of New Caledonia in a bid to defuse a political crisis after 9 days of riots over electoral reforms. And Vietnam's parliament elects top cop Tolam as the state president. He is also likely to be in the race to become the chief of the ruling Communist Party, the country's top job. Hello and welcome. Let's take a look at our top story. After a long flight to the United States, Kenya's President William Ruto is down to business. He is set to meet with US President Joe Biden on Wednesday, with talks focusing on debt relief for the East African country. But back home, the Kenyan president is already facing outrage. This is over his luxury charter plane for his trip to the US. The price of hiring the luxury private jet in which Ruto and his delegation traveled is estimated to be $1.5 million. More than 30 people, including a popular comedian, are reported to be accompanying the president. Now, the chartered aircraft used by William Ruto is from Dubai-owned Royal Jet Company. It is not clear why the president opted for the private jet, but there have been safety concerns about the usual presidential plane, Harambee 1, which was bought nearly 30 years ago. Outrage against Ruto for using a luxury jet comes amid growing dissent over plans by the government to impose additional taxes. The government seeks to raise an additional $2.4 billion in taxes in the coming financial year. But critics say the taxes are only being used to fund extravagance of the government. People in Kenya have been facing a worsening cost of living crisis. Last October, the government suspended non-essential foreign travel in a move aimed at curbing runaway public spending. All ministries and state departments were also directed to reduce their operational budgets by 10%. William Ruto's visit is the first state visit by a Kenyan president to the US in 2 decades, and a first by an African leader in 16 years. But William Ruto is a frequent traveler. He has made more than 50 visits abroad since he became president in 2022, averaging at over 3 a month. He has faced similar criticism over his trips abroad and the cost associated with his alleged penchant for air travel, which is often contrasted with the tough economic conditions at home. So much so that a local media newspaper also nicknamed him the Flying President. While William Ruto continues to notch up his air miles, the questions that he faces from his citizens are getting tougher. Now, for more on this, we're being joined by Patrick Bond, who is a political economist live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Hello to you, Patrick. Thank you for being with us on the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
Now, some Kenyans have expressed outrage that Ruto had chartered an aircraft from the Dubai-owned Royal Jet Company for this trip instead of using his usual presidential plane, given his government's austerity measures and the cost of living crisis. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, and you could even add, Alyson, that Ruto has a very interesting ideological orientation, which he calls hustling, which is a sort of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, entrepreneurship, and very energetic way of addressing his citizenry. And it's not uncommon. We've seen conservative populists move forward in many different locations, but often when they come to power, they are unveiled as part of an elite. And this is just one instance of that has caused some anger in Kenya at a time. The International Monetary Fund is clamping down, a debt crisis on the order of neighboring Ethiopia's, which defaulted 5 months ago, and the controversies, especially over whether Kenya, partly under Ruto's rule, but he was also the deputy president, whether they borrowed too much, especially from China, for one project in particular, the big train line that goes from Mombasa, the port, to the capital of Nairobi. And it's a time when there's a lot of geopolitical tension, the terrain in the Horn of Africa, the terrible droughts, and then a flood this month that killed more than 200, make everyone, I'm sure, as angry at any ostentatiousness. And of course, Ruto is going to reply, well, it's worth it. What we're going to do in the next few days is get some debt relief. We'll have to see if that happens.
Yeah. Right. Now, like we mentioned, William Ruto has faced criticism time and again for his penchant for air travel and for costs associated with it. Ironically, he is visiting the US to hold talks on debt relief for Kenya. While this is a historic visit, since it is the first state visit by a Kenyan president to the US in 2 decades, how could this impact William Ruto's popularity back home?
If he does come back with major concessions, probably mostly from the Bretton Woods institutions, one of which has a new president, A.J. Banga, less than a year in the job, who would very much like to appear to be an ally of the Kenyan people. But on the other hand, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, has also been clamping down, especially on African countries, that during the booming 2010s, and especially with the commodity price increase in 22, that meant, let's say, an excessive debt load. I mean, obviously, COVID created enormous pressures that required debt. And the initial debt relief from the G20 wore off. And it's now time, I think, for everyone to get together. And the dilemma is that China, which has about 17% of the debt owed to it from Kenya, hasn't yet really come to the table. Now, their loans are usually higher interest than the multilateral development banks. Sometimes you can, especially if you're a relatively poor country, you can get quite good discounts. And I think that's going to be one of the questions. Did the loans that especially require, as I say, 17% of the foreign debt to China come with conditions such as control of the Mombasa port as collateral? We don't know any final details, but there have been rumors. So I would wait for a full debt package to come together. And maybe in the next couple of days, in meetings at the World Bank and IMF, Ruto will be able to get some debt relief. It's a very strategic country at this point, being very much in Israel's camp against Palestine, very much on the edge of whether to join the BRICS. So this geopolitical positioning is probably one of the crucial factors as to whether Ruto is going to pull some debt relief home.
Right. Now you've just touched on my next question. Coming to his big meeting with President Joe Biden, what are some of the strategic geopolitical interests for both Kenya and the US? And how might this visit strengthen their diplomatic relations?
I think if I'm sitting in Washington, where I used to live for a little while, I'd be thinking about losing West Africa to coups and a democratic election in Senegal. And I'd be thinking, are we going to lose Kenya In the same way, it was always an AFRICOM, the Africa Command Pentagon ally, and also with that very important Indian Ocean connection, crucial for all of the naval activities that, of course, include now the war against the Houthis. And also, if I'm in Washington, I really don't want to see yet more African countries join the BRICS, and that would include not just Egypt and neighboring Ethiopia that joined last August here in Johannesburg, but potentially Algeria, Senegal, Nigeria, the biggest, most populous country, and then Kenya would be very much on that agenda to bring into BRICS. So I think if I were Joe Biden, this would be a very high priority visit, and to have a state visit, as you say, one of the first for a Kenyan. Last year, Cyril Ramaphosa got the state visit, and that's another terrain of competition. The South African president basically looking to be amongst the English-speaking leaders in Africa. Now, if I'm on the other side in Beijing, then I'd say, well, we really want to start offering much more to Kenya to show that balance. And this is a very tense time, particularly because geopolitical terrain is so full, let's say, a minefield. And to tiptoe through it, I'm not sure Joe Biden puts as much of a priority as one of his predecessors, Barack Obama, who had a Kenyan father, and certainly more than Donald Trump, who had terrible words to say about African countries. But I think it'll be a very interesting outcome to see whether for the BRICS meeting in October, Kenya becomes one of the new or observers, or maybe visitors, or maybe even invited to become a new member. And that remains to be seen. But the conditions are a tug of war, and maybe the Kenyan people will benefit if that includes some concessions.
Yeah. Patrick, thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa and for your analysis there.
Thanks, Alyson.
Shifting focus to South Africa now, in the run-up to the general election, the African National Congress has been facing multiple crises. First, it was the costly divorce with Jacob Zuma last year. This was followed by dwindling support for the party that has held power since the end of apartheid. Analysts say the ANC's share of vote will fall below 50%. Now, which means it could be forced to form a coalition government. That certainly was not all. Closer to the election, the ANC had been facing a cash crunch. The May 29th general election has been touted as the toughest since Nelson Mandela won power in 1994, which means campaigning for the election needed to be intense. But hiring stadiums for rallies, printing T-shirts and posters, supporting organizational machine on election day, all of it is a very expensive affair. As campaigning entered its final stretch, the ANC managed to go all out and seemed to have put its financial woes behind. How? Well, the reason behind the ANC's changing fortunes could be Russia. In the Kalahari Desert, the United Manganese of Kalahari, or the UMK, a controversial mine with Russian connections, digs up manganese. According to reports, the UMK and some of its shareholders contributed almost half of all declared donations to the ANC since the introduction of disclosure requirements in 2021. The mine's investors include Russian billionaire Viktor Vekselberg, who faces Western sanctions for supporting Vladimir Putin's seizure of Crimea. Also among the investors is a South African consortium dominated by Chancellor House Trust, an ANC funding front named after Nelson Mandela's old law firm offices. The UMK mine has declared almost $500 million in dividends since 2013, but the dividends and assets that piled up could not easily flow to the ANC after 2021 because of the enactment of a campaign finance law that was intended to keep big money out of politics. The law put a cap on funds being accepted from a single donor and required all parties to disclose all contributions worth more than 100,000 rand. Until the 7th of May, when President Cyril Ramaphosa signed a law that abolished the cap and disclosure of requirements. The law also gave him powers to set new limits. But until he does so, the political parties are free to stuff their coffers in secret. Was the timing of this law a mere coincidence? Or was it time to give Ramaphosa and the ANC unlimited secret donations for the final leg of campaigning? With support at home dwindling, Ramaphosa seems to be looking for support on the outside, in Russia. What is also interesting to note is that South Africa has refused to condemn Putin's war in Ukraine. It had been trying to establish itself as a non-aligned superpower. From South Africa, let's move to Niger now. Niger's military says it has killed several dozen terrorists in fighting, and 7 of its soldiers had also been killed. Niger says Islamist insurgents attacked a military position in Boni in the western Tillaberi region near Burkina Faso. Tillaberi is in the vast and unstable 3 borders region between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and has been a hotbed of insurgents linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Now, despite massive deployment of forces, insurgents have carried out attacks for years in this region. In March of this year, 23 Niger soldiers were killed in an ambush on a military convoy in the Tillaberi region. 30 attackers were also killed in the fighting that followed. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack. In August last year, 17 Niger soldiers were killed in a terrorist ambush in the area between Boni and Torodi. Now, Niger is ruled by military leaders who seized power in a July coup last year, citing a worsening security situation. The country is one of several West African countries battling an Islamist insurgency that had spread outward from Mali over the last 12 years. Thousands have been killed and millions of lives have been uprooted. Frustrations over the failure of authorities to protect civilians has spurred military coups in the region, including Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, the juntas that seized power have cut ties with Western allies that were assisting local military efforts. Mali and Burkina Faso are witnessing some of the worst violence following the departure of French troops. A UN force also ended operations in Mali at the request of the junta. Mali is now relying on the Russian mercenary group Wagner to fight the insurgents. Junta leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger also signed a security pact pledging to help each other to fight the Islamist insurgents or any external aggression. And finally, to our special segment, Resurgent Africa. Amid stories of coups and crises, we get you tales of hope and positivity that often get overlooked, but not on this show. Our story today is from Zimbabwe. In a groundbreaking study, scientists are taking a deep dive into the social lives of elephants. They have found over 20 gestures through which elephants greet each other. It's a tale of trunk-to-trunk communication, where every flap, reach, and rumble tells a story of a connection and camaraderie among these majestic giants. Get ready to learn about elephant etiquette in our next report.
Oh, hello.
In a world where hellos are as diverse as the emojis on your phone keyboard, it seems elephants are giving humans a run for their linguistic money. Move over hello, as there is a new greeting guru in town, and they have got trunks. According to a recent study by the Jafuta Reserve in Zimbabwe, elephants have been caught red-handed or red-trunked. They were observed engaging in a symphony of greetings in the reserve, from ear flapping to trunk reaching. These gentle giants are pulling out all the stops.
We had seen that when they separated and reunited, elephants used a lot of different movements. They flapped their ears, they spread their ears, they reached with the trunk. And we wanted to know which of these were directed. So if they would use more visual gestures when the recipient was looking at them, or gestures that make a sound when they weren't.
The researchers kept a close eye on 9 elephants, 4 females and 5 males in a semi-captive state. They were allowed to go wild and free during the day. However, at night they were kept in stables. But hold on to your tusks, as this is not just a visual spectacle. It is a multi-sensory extravaganza. The elephants have at least 20 types of gestures. They meet each other with sounds like rumbles, roars and trumpets, adding some serious flair to their already impressive repertoire. There's also a difference between how female and male elephants greet each other. Female elephants have bond groups. Studies show that when different groups meet each other in the wild, they engage in elaborate greeting ceremonies. The male elephants have weaker social bonds. Researchers call their meet and greet a risky reunion. It's a hostile interaction. They mainly meet by smelling each other. So, smell plays an important role in the world of elephant greetings. Who needs a fancy cologne when you've got secretions from a unique gland? Elephants use this unique gland to urinate, defecate, and secrete. It's the elephant equivalent of a signature scent, minus the overpriced bottles.
And they also often used defecation, urination, and had temporal gland secretions, which could be because of the excitement of seeing each other, but could also be because elephants rely extensively on olfaction. So these secretions might actually convey some information to the greeting partner on who they are, if they're at a distance, on what's going on with them, how excited they are, or even their sexual state in the wild, especially.
But what's really heartwarming is the empathy and tenderness displayed by these majestic creatures.
And when they were approaching each other, they would rumble, as if they were looking for each other, and then they knew who was coming to greet them. And then they would start just approaching, flapping their ears, spreading their ears, and then as soon as they were close, engaging in a lot of close contact communication, tactile communication. And something that is interesting is the way they present their rump, which could be an invitation to access olfactory information in the genital area.
So the next time you're struggling to find the perfect greeting, take a leaf out of the elephant's book. In a world full of handshakes and high fives, a gentle bow may be all that you need to make someone's day.
And that's it on the show for today. We will see you again tomorrow at the same time. Thank you for watching and goodbye. Firstpost reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alyson Grange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. South Africa goes to the polls on the 29th of May. I will track the election and bring you ground reports. Is it the end of the road for the African National Congress? And will former President Jacob Zuma stage a dramatic comeback? From elections to climate change, to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global South. Join me every weekday live on Firstpost.